Week 7 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few players I look to buy and trade for this week. The first player is Saquon Barkley of the Philadelphia Eagles. So Saquon, he's had a decent year, but obviously nothing close to what he did last season in a monster year with 2,000 yards rushing for the Philadelphia Eagles. So the last few games for Saquon, mediocre numbers. Week 4, Tampa Bay, 19 carries, 43 rush yards, a touchdown, 4 catches, 31 yards. Week 5 versus Denver, 6 carries, 30 yards, 3 catches, 58 yards, a touchdown. And then week 6 in a matchup, I thought he would go out there and have a big game versus his former team. Only 12 carries, 58 yards, 2 catches, 9 yards. So Saquon Barkley, touchdowns have saved his fantasy days. His best game of the year was week 1 versus Dallas with 18.4 fantasy points. And ever since then, a couple single-digit games and a couple games 17.5 to 17.8 fantasy points. So like I said, Saquon Barkley, rushing yards on the season are graded all 325 on 95 carries on the year. Receiving, he's done a little bit more than he's done in previous seasons. But this offense as a whole right now just looks lost. The only guy who's been consistent week in and week out for the most part, it's been Dallas Goedert. So right now, while Barkley's numbers are down this season and coming off a bad game and a good matchup versus former team of the Giants, I think it's a perfect time to buy him low because I think this Eagle team, they're going to figure things out. I think it's going to start with Saquon Barkley in between the tackles, making some big plays. And it just takes one big run for him to have a big day. So with him bottled up over the last couple of weeks and struggling, he's definitely a back I would buy low this week. The next player, Kenneth Walker of the Seattle Seahawks. A few running backs definitely struggling over the last couple of weeks. I know Walker's in a timeshare in the backfield with Zach Charbonnet. In the last 2 games, he's failed to reach double-digit fantasy points in PPR leagues. In the last few games for Walker, week 4 at Arizona, 19 carries, 81 yards, a catch, 29 yards. Week 5 versus Tampa, 10 carries, 86 yards, a catch, no yards in that one. In week 6 at Jacksonville, 10 carries, 34 yards, a catch, 3 yards. So like I said, I know it's a 50-50 split. I know this is more of a pass-first offense with Sam Darnold and Jackson Smith and the Jigba putting up numbers for the Seahawks team, and they're going out there and winning ball games as well. In week 7, a decent matchup coming up versus Houston Texans, where they're middle of the pack defense, in my opinion. So I think right now, while Kenneth Walker is in a timeshare and not doing much, even though I think he has better upside with his home run hitting ability and receiving prowess, is a player I would go out there and buy this week. I think he's too good to be putting up these mediocre numbers. And this is when you go out there and try to buy low on players where the numbers are struggling and even when the touches are down a little bit. So Walker, like I said, we've seen him have some good seasons early on in his career. And right now, in the timeshare, his numbers are down, but I think he could get back going like he was early in the season. Next running back, Breece Hall of the New York Jets. So Breece Hall, he's getting the workload, but obviously behind the bad offensive line, bad offense overall for this New York Jet team. And there's obviously rumors he might get traded at the NFL trade deadline. So let's say he goes to a team like Arizona or the Los Angeles Chargers, a team that's down to their 3rd and 4th running backs on the roster and need an upgrade. Then Breece Hall, we could see him behind those good offensive lines, go out there and put numbers on the board. So Breece Hall, the last couple weeks, it's been up and down. Week 4, Miami, 14 carries, 81 yards, 5 catches, 30 yards. Week 5 versus Dallas, 14 carries, 113 yards, 4 catches, 42 yards, a fumble loss. And then week 6 versus Denver, 22 carries, 59 yards, where he was bottled up, where obviously Denver, one of the better defenses in the league. So week 7, a good matchup versus the Carolina Panthers. Their defense isn't all that great, even though I know they shut down Javonte Williams in last week's game versus the Dallas Cowboys. And then week 8, a good matchup in Cincinnati. So with 2 good matchups coming up, and then possibly getting traded even before then is Breece Hall. I think he's a buy low candidate. Like I said, the touches have been decent for Breece Hall. I know early in the season he got vultured at the goal line by Braylon Allen. We know Allen's out now for a while with the knee injury. So right now, Breece Hall, after coming off a bad game and not much upside in this Jet offense, where pretty much his ceiling's 16, 17 fantasy points. Also, with a chance him getting traded to a better situation, I would go out there and buy Hall this week. The next player, J.K. Dobbins of the Denver Broncos. So J.K. Dobbins, it's been a solid season for the most part for Dobbins. I know he's been a touchdown-dependent back, and pretty much his ceiling's been 15 fantasy points. But as a number 2 running back for fantasy owners, I think he could go out there and help in a big way. In the next 2 weeks coming up here, in week 7, a good matchup versus the Giants that give up the 7th most fantasy points to backs. And then week 8, a great matchup versus the Cowboys that can't stop anyone on the ground. We just saw Donald go for over 180 yards on the ground versus them. So the last few weeks for Dobbins, week 4 versus Cincinnati, 16 carries, 101 yards, a catch 4 yards. And then week 5 at Philly, 20 carries, 79 yards, a touchdown, a catch 5 yards. And week 6 in London versus the Jets, 14 carries, 40 yards. So like I said, 2 good matchups coming up for J.K. Dobbins. I know his ceiling's pretty much been 15 fantasy points at most. And also as well, we really haven't seen much out of R.J. Harvey. He's more of the passing downs back and receiving back more than anything. So J.K. Dobbins, while he's been solid this season, I still think on a discount you could go out there and get him on your fantasy roster, and with a good schedule coming up and still the running back that's going to get 75% of the touches in that backfield. Definitely someone to go out there and buy this week. The next player, Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. I mentioned Zay Flowers last week as well on the bye list, and Flowers, we know he's been banged up. We know he hasn't done much, but now it looks like Lamar Jackson, after this bye week in week 7 for Baltimore, is going to come back in week 8 with a good matchup versus Chicago Bears. So the last few games for Flowers, after he got off to a nice start the first 2 weeks of the season, the numbers have dropped off with Cooper Rush and Tyler Huntley in there. Week 5 versus Houston, 5 catches, 72 yards. And then week 6 versus the Rams, he did have 10 targets in the 17-3 loss, 6 catches, 46 yards, and a fumble loss. So like I said, when Lamar Jackson gets back to this lineup, everything's going to improve, obviously, for this Baltimore Raven team, even though we know they're 1-5 on the season and their season's pretty much over at this point. But Lamar coming back in the lineup and 2 good matchups after the bye week versus Chicago and Miami. I think Zay Flowers could get back to putting up the numbers, and he's still the number 1 option, in my opinion, in the passing game. So this whole Baltimore offense as a whole, if you want to go out there and get obviously a Mark Andrews or Derrick Henry, even though he came off a big game last week in week 6 versus the Rams, you go out there and make the deal, because with Lamar coming back, this whole offense, they're going to get back to putting up numbers and putting points on the board. And Flowers a bye this week. The next player, Keenan Allen of the Los Angeles Chargers. So Keenan Allen, the first few weeks of the season, he was off to a big start. And now the last couple weeks, the numbers have dropped off a little bit for Keenan Allen, with only 1 double-digit fantasy game in the last 3 games. And the first 3 weeks, he had 17 or more fantasy points in PPR leagues. Week 4 at the Giants, 5 catches, 37 yards, 7 targets. Week 5 versus the Commanders, 5 catches, 58 yards, 9 targets. In week 6 at Miami, only 4 catches, 27 yards, 7 targets. So the last couple games, numbers are down for Keenan Allen, but the targets are there. And also Quentin Johnston missed that game week 6 in Miami. So after a bad couple games, and we know him and Justin Herbert have been locked in for many seasons, even last year not being with the Chargers, he came back this year, Keenan Allen, and got off to a big start. So right now, after a few down games and a good matchup coming up in week 7 here versus Indianapolis, that gives up the 5th most fantasy points to wide receivers on the season. I think Keenan Allen, he's going to get things going once again. He's still got something left in the tank, obviously. We saw it early in the season. And him and Justin Herbert, they've been locked in for years, and he's a buy low player this week. I know Lab McConkey's getting back to what he was doing last season, but Keenan Allen will have his games as well. And the final player, Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. So Michael Pittman, he's had a solid season, and Daniel Jones, just a quarterback change, pretty much changed his whole offense and this whole team around 5-1 on the season in the early going for Indianapolis. So Michael Pittman, 3 games in a row before last week, he put in a dud with double-digit fantasy points. Week 4 at the Rams, 5 catches, 41 yards, a touchdown, 10 targets. Week 5 versus Vegas, 5 catches, 39 yards, a touchdown, 6 targets. In week 6 versus Arizona, 2 catches, 20 yards, 3 targets. I know Josh Downs, he had a good ball game. I know Tyler Warren found the end zone again in that one versus the Arizona Cardinals. Michael Pittman easily is a top 2 target in this passing game for Daniel Jones and the Colts. I think Warren's the number 1 option, and then you got Pittman and Downs. He'll have a couple games here and there, but Pittman coming off a bad game and a decent matchup coming up at the Chargers, where that could be a high-scoring game between these 2 teams. Then he has Tennessee coming up. I think Pittman, you throw some feelers out there and see if we could get him in a deal. And obviously, I don't think he's a great wide receiver, but a solid back into flex number 3 option for fantasy owners. No, for game, he didn't do much. He's a buy low player this week, so that's a few players I look to buy and trade for week 7 of the fantasy football season.